when I pulled into my driveway and saw nothing but a raw scar of dirt where my house had stood early that morning. I felt my stomach drop so hard it was like missing a step in the dark. There were tracks in the thick mud, broken boards in the front yard, and the smell of wet earth hanging in the air like a crime scene that had not finished happening yet. I stood there with my keys still in my hand, staring at the empty place where my home used to be, and the first thing I heard was my own voice asking a question I still can't believe I had to ask. Who bulldozes a man's house and thinks they can get away with it? Let me take you back to how all of this actually started. I owned a quiet piece of property at the edge of a lake community. It's the kind of place people moved to when they wanted fresh air, clean lines, and neighbors who smiled too much at board meetings. My humble little home was not fancy, but it was mine. I built my life there, one project at a time. The porch I stained myself, the driveway I patched after every rainy season, the little workshop in back where I kept my tools neatly lined up like they mattered because they did. I took pride in that place because every inch of it had cost me time, money, and sweat. The HOA president was a woman named Margaret, and she had the kind of fake smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret liked rules the way some people like power. She talked about community standards the way a banker talks about debt. At first, I ignored her little letters and warnings because they were always about something petty. A planter box, a fence color, a truck parked too long in my own drive. I paid my dues, kept my property clean, and figured common sense would eventually win out. It didn't. The first major warning sign came when Margaret claimed my house violated a preservation zone rule I had never seen in the covenant packet. She said my roofline blocked a sightline from the main road, and she wanted me to make changes immediately. I asked for the rule in writing. I asked for the survey. I asked for the board vote. She acted like I was the one being difficult. That was when I realized this wasn't about a roof. It was about control. Then I simply had to leave town for 10 days to deal with my mother's medical appointment out of state. I locked everything up, told a neighbor to keep an eye on the place, and left with the same peace of mind any homeowner should have had. 4 days later, while I was still gone, Margaret and the HOA sent a crew onto my land. I made it trim a tree. They didn't post another notice, made bulldoze my house. When I came back and saw the destruction, I remember feeling strangely calm for about 10 seconds, the kind of calm that comes right before your entire life changes. Because standing there in the wreckage, I knew two things at once. Someone had crossed a border they could never uncross, and they had made one terrible mistake. They had destroyed something that was legally mine while I was away, and they had done it to a man who kept every paper, every deed, every single receipt, and every communication in a locked file drawer. The question was no longer whether they had gone too far. The question was how far they were going to fall once I proved it. The first thing I did after I got over the big shock was call the police, and the second thing I did was start documenting everything. I took photos from every angle, recorded the tire tracks, saved the timestamps, and pulled every email Margaret had ever sent me. The deputy who arrived looked around, looked at the torn-up foundation, and asked me if there had been a demolition permit. I told him no. I had never given permission for anyone to touch my house, and I certainly had never agreed to have it reduced to a pile of rubble while I was out of state. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Margaret doubled down. By the next morning, I had a certified letter from the HOA attorney claiming the structure had been non-compliant and that the association had acted to preserve neighborhood uniformity. That letter would have been laughable if it hadn't been attached to a financial threat. They wanted me to just accept the demolition as a necessary enforcement action and pay for the cleanup myself. They even had the nerve to suggest that because the house had allegedly violated community standards, the HOA was within its rights to remove it. Called my attorney before I called anyone else. He read the letter, then asked me one question. Did they have title to your property? They didn't. That changed everything. We pulled the deed, the records, the recorded covenant language, the meeting minutes, contractor invoices, and the county permit records. What we found made the whole thing uglier. The HOA had no demolition authority, no emergency order, and no permission. Worse, the contractor they used had signed off on the work based on Margaret's verbal claim that the board had approved it. There was no valid board vote in the minutes, no owner notice, no recorded violation process, nothing. Then came the twist that made Margaret's confidence crack. One of the board members, a retired accountant named Arthur, quietly called me after seeing the site photos online. He said he had voted against the demolition and had warned Margaret that the association did not have the legal authority to destroy an occupied home. According to him, she told the contractor to do it now and sort out the paperwork later. That was the moment the case stopped being a misunderstanding and started looking like a deliberate abuse of power. We sent a demand letter. The HOA ignored it. We filed suit. The HOA called it a bluff. Then we requested the internal communications, and that's when the emails started to tell the real story. Margaret had been furious that I refused to repaint, refused to move the workshop, and refused to bow to her latest list of demands. In one of the messages, she wrote that she was tired of letting one homeowner embarrass the entire association. In another, she told the contractor to clear the lot before he gets back. She thought she was managing a nuisance issue. What she had actually done was create evidence. The most important document in the whole case was a clause in the recorded property records that gave me exclusive rights to the structure and the land beneath it. My lawyer pointed to the language and said the HOA had no more right to destroy my house than they had to drive a truck through the county courthouse. They had not enforced a rule. They had committed trespass, property conversion, and destruction of property. And they had done it with a paper trail. By then, I wasn't just angry. I was methodical. I knew exactly what they had missed, and I knew exactly what would happen when they learned that their own records were about to be used against them. The day of the hearing, Margaret walked into the courtroom dressed like she was about to run a board meeting, not defend a demolition. She brought 2 HOA attorneys, a big stack of binders, and the same smug expression she had worn every time she thought she was about to corner me. She looked at me once, gave a tiny shake of her head, and sat down like the outcome had already been decided. That was her last mistake. My attorney opened with the permit records, then the deed, then the HOA's own bylaws. He showed the judge that the association had no demolition power over my home, no emergency authority, and no valid board authorization. Then he played the emails. Margaret's face changed in real time as her own words appeared on the screen. Clear the lot before he gets back. That line hung in the courtroom like thick smoke. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the structure was unsafe and that the board had acted in the interest of the community. The judge did not look impressed. He asked a simple question. If the house was unsafe, where was the inspection report? Where was the notice? Where was the injunction? Where was the court order? There wasn't one. Then my attorney called Arthur, the board member who had opposed the demolition. He testified that the board never authorized what Margaret ordered and that she had told others to act first and defend later. When he said that, the room went silent. Even the court reporter paused for a second before continuing to type. Margaret's lawyers suddenly looked less like defenders and more like people realizing they had boarded a sinking ship. And right there, with the judge flipping through the records and the HOA's own witnesses unraveling their story, I felt the pressure in the room shift. For anyone watching a fight over property, rights, and raw arrogance, this is the kind of moment you never forget. If stories about standing your ground when someone with power thinks they can crush you are your thing, hit like and subscribe to HO Drama Neighbor right now, because the collapse that followed was the kind of moment people talk about for years. The judge asked whether the HOA had contacted law enforcement before the demolition, whether they had notified me, whether they had obtained any legal process at all. No again. Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear. The association had acted outside its authority, and the damage was not merely improper, it was unlawful. That was the turning point. The HOA's confidence evaporated in real time. Margaret stopped looking at the judge and started looking at the floor. Their attorney asked for a recess, but it was too late. The record was already in, the testimony was already given, and the emails had already exposed the truth. By the time the hearing ended, it was obvious to us, all in that room, that the HOA's power had run straight into the wall of its own misconduct. The final ruling was brutal for the HOA. The judge ordered the association to pay for the full reconstruction of my home entirely, restore the property, reimburse my temporary housing costs, and cover the loss of personal property and business equipment that had been destroyed with the house. He also imposed sanctions for bad faith conduct and referred the matter for further civil review. In the end, the total judgment landed at $15 million, a number so large it made Margaret's mouth fall open before she could hide it. But money was not the only consequence. The HOA was forced to issue a public correction, admitting it had no authority to demolish my home. Several board members resigned within days. Margaret lost her position in disgrace, and the contractor who carried out the work faced his own problems once investigators started asking how a house disappeared without a lawful order. The rebuild itself became a symbol of the case. Every beam, every wall, every nail standing as solid proof that they had destroyed the wrong man's property and then had to put it back piece by piece. When the first crews returned to rebuild, I stood on the edge of the lot and watched the foundation take shape again. It didn't erase what happened, and it didn't make the waiting easy. But it did give me something I had almost lost in that first moment of shock. The sense that the world can still correct itself when enough truth gets put on the record. What they did to me was outrageous. What happened to them after was a lesson they should have learned before they ever touched my house. I still think about that day I came home and found my home gone. I think about all the silence, the dirt, and the feeling of being so wrong that words almost failed. But I also think about what it meant to stand there later and watch the law do what the HOA refused to do on its own: hold power strictly accountable. Before you leave, I want to know something real. Have you ever seen someone with authority cross the line and then act surprised when the truth catches up with them? Share your story in the comments, because the best ones are the ones people are usually afraid to tell out loud. And if you want the follow-up about how Margaret tried one last desperate appeal and made things even worse for herself, watch HOA Drama Neighbor.